From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones.
Every country will be here. Nearly 150 heads of state and government. And this is an opportunity we cannot miss.
The UN General Assembly's 80th session is underway.
Normally, this would be a moment to celebrate. But are we really in a mood for celebration?
Ukraine and Sudan are still consumed by war. Fighting and famine continues in Gaza.
There are images taken from the Israel-Gaza border, and it shows plumes of smoke rising above the city. This is happening as a new United Nations report is claiming that Israeli forces are committing genocide in Gaza.
And yet the seemingly ineffectual debating and voting at the UN continues. There'll be a lot more of this week with the so-called high-level meetings. And ahead of those talks, the UK, the Australians and the Canadians formally declared yesterday that they will recognise a Palestinian state. But to what end? When so little seems to be changing in the world beyond the UN's New York skyscraper home. As it reaches a milestone, the story today is the UN useless.
So in the mid-1970s, I went in as a young intern-to-be to the UN. It had been a dream for me to work there, and I got sort of posted to the office of the Secretary General, a very glamorous high-level posting for such a beginner.
Lord Malloch-Brown, Mark Malloch-Brown, is a British diplomat.
They wanted me to draft and write memos, and off the back of that, I found myself sitting at a desk outside his top American deputy's office. And the irony was, 30 plus years later, I returned to that same office in the now created position of UN Deputy Secretary General. So in a strange way, from my life as an intern to being the number 2 in the organization, I'd moved all of about 5 feet at one level, but at another, I'd seen the world in between.
Before we get into the challenges of this coming week and all the various cries of what has the UN done for us, would you say from your time working there, particularly thinking up to the millennium and beyond, that good was done, things were achieved, there is a purpose?
Yes, I think this United Nations has been very much part of the post-Second World War history.
Then in the midst of the war, America took the lead in an attempt to prevent another one. The United Nations came into being. In Moscow, 3 nations planned that this should not happen again.
Here was a world exhausted by war, one where the US recognized it was going to have to take up the burden of global policemen from Europe, these exhausted colonial powers, but was very wary of doing it on its own, and saw a multilateral system as a way of leveraging others to contribute to that mission of keeping the peace and securing international development.
The eyes of all mankind focus on San Francisco, scene of one of the most significant and decisive meetings in human history. From 47 United Nations come the men and women who carry with them the hope of the world's 2 billion people for lasting peace.
And so the Charter, I think, represented a pivot by the world as a whole, away from a sort of Westphalian realist school of how international affairs should be conducted to a more idealistic one, which really did put human rights and shared values of solidarity and universality at the heart of the conduct of affairs. And then when I worked at the UN as its number 2, and before that as head of its development activities around the world, there was again a massive alignment under Kofi Annan as Secretary General when you're in the post-Berlin Wall period, the 1990s and the first decade of this century. There was a huge shared ambition to really kickstart development, to bring down poverty around the world, to improve educational and health outcomes. And you had a bunch of, relatively progressive governments across Europe, Labour government here in the UK, French, German governments of similar like-mindedness, President Clinton in the US, all of whom shared this vision of multilateral action to really change the course of world development.
For the first time in history, more than half the people represented in this assembly freely choose their own governments. Early in the 21st century, more than 20 of this assembly's members, home to half the Earth's population, will lift themselves from the ranks of low-income nations.
So there have been these dramatic periods where the UN has been able to galvanize this exciting response. But, I have to say that even when you put them together, they've been a minority of the UN's 80 years of existence, that for more of its lifespan, it's been battling the ghosts of communist wars or other massive geopolitical disputes.
And clearly, I would suggest we're in one of those periods of misalignment. As this 80th UN General Assembly gets underway and these high-level meetings we've got this week.
I mean, there have been plenty of misalignments in the past. The US is the sort of founding inspiration and spirit for the UN. That American leadership, hegemonic in many ways, but nevertheless one that sort of allowed the UN its global role, it was often under stress. First the McCarthy investigations of UN staff for communist sympathies, deep fears long before the rise of the MAGA right in America amongst more traditional right-wing groups, that UN helicopters were seen about to invade the hinterland of the United States, the massive difference of opinion around the Iraq war, where the Security Council largely opposed American and British ambitions to overthrow Saddam Hussein. So there have been huge points of tension and conflict and confrontation. But, what I think is different this time is this is the first time you've had an American president who openly disavows the very principles and values of the organization.
We will never surrender America's sovereignty to an unelected, unaccountable global bureaucracy. America is governed by Americans. We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism.
You have an American administration which just denies the whole value proposition of the UN around...
And defunds.
And defunds, which again is not new, but defunding on this scale, it reflects just this complete break of values, a world where the idea that you work for a common humanity and that there is a global good which goes further than just your national priority, has been completely trashed and put aside in favor of a politics of national interest. And so that is a real assault on the core idea of the United Nations.
This week is when the leaders or the sort of senior ministers from countries descend for these high-level meetings. A lot of attention is going to be on the meetings expected about what is happening in Gaza and the Palestinian question. How do these actually work, and what fruit can any of them bear? Or is it just, another talking shop?
Well, I think this particular UNGA, as it's called, UN General Assembly, even though it is to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the organization, unlike the 70th, 10 years ago, when pretty much all the world leaders showed up, is going to be a pretty sort of empty event with, representation at a lower level. The big meeting will be the Palestinian one, but even that, it will be more subdued than had originally been anticipated, because the US has used its visa-giving power as the host country for New York, UN, to not allow the PLO delegation to come at the anticipated level of the head of the PLO.
In just a few weeks, the world will watch a procession of world leaders take to this stage to speak to the UN General Assembly. But this year, the familiar face of Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas will likely be missing, along with 80 members of his delegation after the Trump administration denied their visas.
So Mahmoud Abbas can't come, the sort of de facto Palestinian leader, but their mission already in New York.
They've got a mission in New York, so they'll be represented.
Yeah.
But they're not going to have the high-level attendance and the fanfare that was anticipated it would generate.
But also our Prime Minister isn't going either. So I wonder,
Right.
is there even any
well, as I say,
leaders?
There are some, but it's going to be much lower level than before. I mean, President Trump is still scheduled to go. But if you take it as a poll of the UN's difficulties and standings, it's going to be a meeting which suggests the UN is bumping around somewhere near bottom.
Over the next few days, we've got more countries saying they will recognise a Palestinian state. Britain, of course, did over the weekend. Do you think that will actually have any kind of impact, or is it just gesture politics, as some people are writing it off as?
Well, look, 145 member states have over the years already recognized Palestine, and it has this strange status of a sort of PLO seat in the UN already, although, it doesn't have the normal territorial condition of being a state. And, this next few days, it's anticipated another 10 states, including France, will recognize. So it's an incremental step up in something that's not new. But it is important because Britain and France historically had a foundational role in what's happened in the Middle East, going back to the beginning of the 20th century and the Sykes-Picot agreement to how to divide up the region. The Britain of today may not make Netanyahu quake in his boots when it recognizes, but it does have a real resonance historically. And I think that's what this is about. It's less about thinking that somehow adding 10 more names to those who recognize the Palestinian state is suddenly going to tip the balance of negotiations in a dramatic breakthrough direction. It's not. But what I think it does show is the steady erosion of Israel's standing in the world, its loss of public opinion, which, by the way, is also happening amongst the American public, wherever their government is. And I think this is, over time, going to force some kind of moment of truth and clarity in Israeli politics where, there's a recognition that despite its massively successful military campaigns of the last year or so, it's got to get back onto a political track if it wants to find a sustainable solution to this.
And what of the UN's role itself in all of this? I mean, there's been lots of criticism of how the UN has handled this whole conflict. From the Palestinian side, people might say they've not been muscular enough in condemning Israel and in getting aid in there. On the Israeli side, of course, they've got lots of grievances against the UN, namely a UN investigation itself, suggesting that some of its own staff might have been involved in October 7th. Do you think the UN has played this badly, aside from the big powers that influence it?
Well, let me step back and say it's always difficult. I mean, the UN is both its secretariat and staff and its member states. And when the member states don't like what's happening, they manage to sort of devolve the responsibility onto the Secretariat and staff and the Secretary General. When they do like what's happening, it's all the collective wisdom of those member states. And, in truth, the Secretariat and the Secretary General are significantly prisoners of the member states. When you have a very powerful member state, as you do in the case of this conflict, or the Russians in the case of Ukraine, it is incredibly inhibiting of UN action because both the US and Russia can, on those two conflicts, and do exercise their veto in the Security Council, which limits the freedom of maneuver.
14 votes in favour, 1 vote against. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council.
The United States rejects this unacceptable resolution.
Dear colleagues, we deeply regret the decision of the Russian Federation to veto the resolution.
Russia, you can veto this resolution, but you cannot veto our voices.
The draft resolution has not been adopted.
But, within that, it doesn't stop a Secretary General, or shouldn't stop a Secretary General, leading a dynamic humanitarian response and using his good offices to try and do everything he can around the margin politically to get a political process going, and using his voice to call out breakdowns of the rules of law and proper treatment of civilians. And, this Secretary General has tried to use his voice and has tried to push on the humanitarian front. But there is a view that the UN is, really just lost its force and energy on this set of issues. That the one exception is the humanitarian, where it is pushing hard. But elsewhere on the political side, it's just sort of shouting empty words from the sideline and nobody's listening.
Thinking about how the UN is faring at the moment, when would you say in modern history the wheels maybe slightly started to come off the cart? Would we go back to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine most recently? Would we go back to the Iraq War? I mean, where would you point us to?
Yeah, I think the Iraq War is the precursor to this, but nevertheless, it was followed again by a period of relative collaboration around other crises, for example, on Sudan, which today is completely ignored by the international community. At that time, I sometimes felt President George Bush and Tony Blair were kind of like the desk officers for Sudan, calling Kofi up, and sometimes their lieutenants calling me up to, demand that we did more about Darfur, sending their ministers to conferences intended to stabilize the situation in Sudan and fund its reconstruction. Very much doubt Donald Trump could find Sudan on the map. So we've really, in that sense, gone from the Iraq thing, which was already a break, to a much more generalized breach. And what's sort of led to this, rapid new free fall in the UN standing? Yes, I think it does start with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russia had been interfering in Ukraine since 2014, if not earlier, but, it was the open invasion and the complete breach of the commitment of the Charter rule not to invade a neighbor without just cause, which set off a collapse in the authority of the Security Council, which then has only been reinforced, not just by the Trump administration, let me say, but by the Biden administration too, which was, every bit as weak and hopeless when it came to this conflict.
And tracking that back to the start of the Iraq War, as you mentioned, some would argue similarly, the US and others invading Iraq without just cause, as it turned out.
Yeah, no, so exactly. So this is always the problem. It's not as though one can point to, a pristine record of obeying the UN Charter in its 80 years of existence. And so, when countries want to behave badly, they've got plenty of precedent to call on. Now, the difficulty's always been that, in truth, nations, not just their leaders, but their voters, are always going to be asking the question about international affairs, what's in it for us? And the moment countries get too detached from their own national interests and are seen by their voters as, having gotten lost in some liberal pipe dream of a beautiful new world, which is going to cost them as taxpayers, but not really change their daily condition in any meaningful way, you get in trouble. And we're at one of those moments where there is, a fierce reaction against globalization. And the UN is very much a victim of all of that and has not found its voice or found it a way to take a stand to take that on.
But how can it possibly do that if its whole reason for existing is a table for everybody to discuss issues at? I mean, how can you balance being both that, an all-encompassing forum, and also a force pushing a certain set of values which, as you say, might not necessarily be signed up to by some of the big players?
Well, it's challenging. And I think for these first 80 years, universality has been the key principle, that it's the one place everybody's there. So, China is not in the G7. Russia can't attend the G20 at the moment. So Russia and China have created their own set of institutions, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which met at the beginning of September, and there was a very powerful picture of Prime Minister Modi of India, along with President Xi of China and Putin of Russia. So you've got these new formations out there, but none of them universal. And so everybody said, let's make sure that whatever their differences, people stay around that UN table. I think we've reached the point where the sort of fallout with the parent, the original parent, the US, over the sort of values of the Charter is so profound that the UN has to become much more of a campaigning organization which prioritizes the Charter and invites countries which share that priority to sort of organize into sort of mini multilateralism coalitions of the willing and prioritize that over universality, to say that, just having countries in there to block and oppose, a human rights agenda or an agenda of ending wars is not good enough anymore. And to get the countries which want the UN to be effective to really take a much more prominent role in its leadership. And, there are different sort of candidate countries for that. Most controversially, there's China, which, President Xi now doesn't lose any opportunity to talk about China's commitment to the international rule of law and to the UN and multilateralism, contrasting himself very deliberately with the sort of rogue state of Trump's America. But then you've got, perhaps a more thoughtful, more acceptable group of countries such as Brazil, India, South Africa, who similarly want to step up and make the UN a much better reflection of their emerging interests as powers. And then you've got a third coalition of smaller countries which crosses all regions. So now you've seen countries like Singapore and other smaller Asian countries weigh into this group, or Caribbean islands, countries like Ghana in Africa, all starting to make common cause because they recognize that a world where the UN authority has collapsed and you're back to a world of power over values, if you like, is not one which is going to be kind to them as smaller powers. So I think the UN's got quite a few constituencies of support if it had the courage to activate them.
But can't do if it has countries like the US maybe not behind it, and maybe countries like China with their own motives for how they might want things to change. So does that leave us in the interim with a UN which is, at a time of heightened conflict around the world, a UN that diplomatically is broadly useless?
No, I don't think necessarily. I mean, during the Cold War, the Security Council was broadly as useless as it is today. But the UN ran humanitarian operations around the world, of which I played a part in that younger stage of my career, where, I remember a Secretary General showing up on the Thai-Cambodian border where I had set up refugee camps with my colleagues for hundreds of thousands of people, and him looking around in amazement and saying to me, nobody told me about this. And I having the presence of mind not to say to him, well, to be honest, as Secretary General, we've rather deliberately kept the secret because, we didn't want the Security Council and the political side of the UN messing in this. We wanted to keep it a humanitarian operation, which both the US and the Soviet Union would feel they didn't need to oppose. And so you saw this period when the UN was highly active on the humanitarian agenda as the proxy wars of the Cold War years generated refugee displacement from Central America to Indochina to South Asia. And, we were allowed in to deal with human consequences of that. And so, the UN has been adept at finding space to be effective, even at times of global political gridlock when, its own political side has been pretty much neutralized by that. So, I think next year we'll see the campaign for a new Secretary General. Theoretically, the sort of big three, China, Russia, and America, could, in the proverbial smoke-filled room, veto a candidate they don't like. But I think what it takes is the rest of the world say, we've had enough of the candidates you've imposed on us. We want an activist Secretary General who's going to not go and poke America in the eye or Russia in the eye, but is going to get on with the job of organizing other countries around the tasks the UN can do, even at a time of geopolitical conflict. And, until now, with the exception of Kofi Annan, most Secretary Generals have been diplomats first and foremost, as the world's chief diplomat, as they're often called. I think we're going to get a Secretary General this time round, if we're lucky, who will be the world's chief campaigner, who's going to really, and is not going to look for every country to support him or her, and it's likely to be a her this time, on every issue, but is going to put together prevailing coalitions and is going to get past everything having to be done by consensus or everything having to get round a veto in the Security Council, and is going to find new ways of working to champion the original Charter ambitions, which are as valid today as they were 80 years ago.
Mark Malloch-Brown, a former UN Deputy Secretary General, and much more besides. You can keep up with everything as it unfolds in New York at the UN over at thetimes.com if you have got a subscription. That is it from us today. Today's producer was Taryn Siegel. The executive producer was Kate Lamble. Sound design was by David Crackles. And theme composition was by Mao Lassetto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.